Okay, we are back, and I am so delighted to introduce two really phenomenal guests. This is, of course, Professor Nicholas Baragwanath, and this is the award-winning cellist Elinor Frey. And thank you, both of you, for coming on the show. This is a hexachordal solfeggio show, and it's going to be really so much fun. I think the audience question that sort of started this off was a question here that I just want to share on the screen. I was coming back from the summer break, and I was asking people for who should I invite back on the show, and Ezekiel here said that I would like to hear from Baragwanath and learn more about solfeggio, especially about Guidonian hand and its uses for modern musicians for teaching music, and also how gallant musicians learn to read fluently in all clefs and how that can be taught to modern musicians. So we use this as a launching point. And Nick, when I emailed you, you said you were having a fascinating research project that was ongoing with Elinor. And so I'm just really thrilled to have both of you on. Welcome to the show, first of all.
Well, thank you very much.
So we'll start with you, Elinor. Elinor, can you just give a little intro? I think people should know Professor Baragwanath. I obsessively interview him, so they have a little idea of who he is, because I'm such a fan of solfeggio. But Elinor, why don't you just give your background and just introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, I just want to say I love your show, and I've listened to a lot of your episodes, and thanks a lot for having us. So yeah, I'm a cellist, and I live in Montreal, Canada, and I teach at McGill and University of Montreal, but mostly I just roam around and play concerts. And I've always been somebody who likes to keep learning, and I always have projects where I apply for grants to maybe learn new techniques on the cello or about new instruments or about history. And usually that leads to like a CD project and sometimes a publication. I've published a bunch of volumes of sheet music, and I do musicological research for that. And I just love the idea that I'm changing, and that the way I play now is very different from the way I played 5 or 10 years ago. And so last year I did a degree in basso continuo on the cello. It was sort of the first of its kind, the first year it was offered, at the Brussels Conservatory. And that means I learned how to add chords, and read partimenti, and to basically understand a lot more about harmony and continuo playing, but from a really physical point of view on the cello, so that the chords were under my hands. It's really not something we cellists learn in a typical conservatory education. And I thought that was absolutely wonderful. But I really love playing sonatas, and I love playing concertos, and I like being the star. So I sort of was, well, what about the melody? And I started looking at Professor Baragwanath's book. I don't know what I should call you.
Nick.
And and I had this kind of intense gut reaction. I have it here. And I sort of, my gut said, this is really important and special, and this is what we're missing in our conservatory education. Because, I had a good education. I went to Mannes College of Music, and there was a lot of theory there. I went to Juilliard. I went to McGill. I had a great education, but none of it led to me to feel comfortable improvising, playing the continuo, or certainly not composing. And I didn't really understand that well the music I was playing, which, could be my fault, but I think it's also just the way we're trained. And sorry, but it's a little bit blurry, but hopefully you can see me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I started working with Nick, and I think he got a sense that I was pretty intense and serious about it, and listened to some of my recordings, and I think he liked them. So we sort of cooked up a project together, where we would do a long-term project, and it's just super exciting. And maybe I'll let Nick say more about what our actual project is.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Elinor. Yeah, I mean, so Eleanor sort of got in touch with me, sort of wanting to know more about solfeggio, and I get quite a few people contact me with this. But Eleanor's a little bit special because she's a really amazing Baroque cellist. And she'd also, before she met me, by the way, she'd recorded some recordings with her own variations. So some of her recordings of 18th century repertory.
Yeah.
She's actually, unlike a lot of other performers, she actually puts on the tracks, a whole set of her own variations.
What?
And these show
Who does that? Who does that?
Well, that's what they used to do. Yeah,
I know,
that's what the 18th century cellists did.
It was a little bit scary the day the CD was released. Oh my God, what are people going to say about this?
Can you show? It's the Del Abaco one, isn't it? It's the one at the top there,
yeah,
I think. That
the
has
last
the variation.
one.
Yeah. So everybody, these are amazing. So Eleanor put her own personal variations of these, 18th century compositions, and she's very talented at it. She's got a great ability at this. But I think when she came across historical solfeggio, she suddenly saw, I think the gut moment was, oh, that's what I've been trying to do, and I didn't quite know the historical precedent for that. So obviously this was music to my ears in many ways. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. What would happen if we work together on learning solfeggio in the 18th century way? We learn improvisation patterns. We start to repeat and go through a whole series of lessons. How might this change Eleanor's practice? What's going to happen with this? And I don't think either of us really know what's going to happen, but we've had some.
It'll take a long time. We're in the middle of it right now.
Well, we certainly learned that it takes a long time. It's not something you can do in a couple of lessons. But for instance, we're trying to learn a concerto by Leo without notation. So I'm teaching it by singing the patterns, and she then plays back and varies and repeats. And we're trying various different things that are quite fascinating. If anyone's interested, by the way, I'll get this out the way first of all. Yes, that's Leo, isn't it? We've got an event going on in Oxford in February. So I think it's on 23rd of, I need to check the date. 23rd.
Concert on the 23rd and lecture on the 25th.
Thank you. Yes. So 23rd and 25th in Oxford, we're doing an event with Torch. That's the Oxford Centre for Research in the Humanities. And that could be interesting. That's where we're going to present some of our preliminary findings. And then we're also giving a concert and doing some talks in Montreal in Canada in April. So that's kind of the way we're going to be talking. We're also going to be hosting a blog, more on that anon, and publishing results and making it all available. But it's really exciting because for me, it gets me out of academia. So I'm not just digging around in archives and publishing, books and articles which are for academics. I'm actually working with a real musician who's trying this system in her own practice. So, today, what I thought we'd do for the program, there's also many questions people want to ask about solfeggio in general. That's fine. What I can offer with that, I can go through a little bit of a solfeggio for you and show you how it works for those who may be new to this, and also a refresher for those who are more familiar. If anyone wants, I've also got some new manuscript evidence of traits of those things where you sing several syllables to several notes to one syllable. And I've got some manuscript evidence which may be interesting for those who are a little bit more familiar with this. Otherwise, I think we'd all want to hear a little bit of more from Eleanor, and maybe even if she plays the cello, yes, because she's an absolutely fantastic cellist. And maybe underhand, overhand, I don't know, whichever way you want to do it.
Yeah, I tell Nick about, I have like 6 million simultaneous projects, so I tell Nick a little bit about some of the others, which includes playing underhand. Maybe I would just say one thing and play something really quickly that could show kind of how my understanding and thinking about music is changing a little bit. I just wanted to say how, when in 2010, I did a Fulbright in Italy. I was really lucky to spend almost a whole year gorging on a pizza and gelato and espresso for a year, and practicing cello and learning all about the history of cello. And I was really, a lot of the reading and the work I did was sort of musicological in the sense of understanding the lives and the stories behind their lives. And I remember at the end of the year, I had a kind of glory trip where I took myself around. Let's say I went to Bologna and Rome and Naples and places where all these great first cellists, and Venice and Padova, where Bandini was. And I saw the places they worked, and I saw the places that they walked, maybe carrying their instrument. And whereas a year before I wouldn't have known, it would sort of came to life for me. I saw with my own eyes a bit of their story, and it really was meaningful to me because it wasn't just a invented thing. Like it was in front of my eyes, and it made their music come alive more for me. And yeah, there's Vandini playing underhand. He worked in Padova with Tartini. And um, and I feel like with solfeggio, what it is a similar kind of going back in time into their world, but more from the sense of how they thought about music. I feel like I can enter into uh, their their way of thinking and composing and learning about music, and I feel a bit more close to the Baroque or the 18th century composer cellists now. I find that really inspiring. And I'll just show you like an example of something that came up the other day. Hopefully, I'm not too blurry. Well, like for example, the other day I was practicing the Sixth Suite by Bach, and my ear picked up on a typical solfeggio pattern. Yeah, exactly, the Kurwan. And my ear said, "Isn't that kind of a monte?" And I learned two-step monte. If it went on, it could be three steps. But and there's even an ingano, which for solfeggio people, means you jump to another hexachord to find the syllable. So it's a sol fa mi. The sol could be there or there, and then sol fa mi. So as I was practicing this, I had this delightful moment where Bach started the piece off with the soul of the Monte, and I just felt like sort of a chuckle, like I was following along his little games and his story, and it just made it sort of fun and interesting. So that's just an example of how as I'm playing now, I'm picking things out that I might never have realized what's happening in the music.
Okay, so Elinor, I wanted to ask you a question. You said that after working with Nick, you had this ability. You suddenly started looking at music, and you started being able to almost have a conversation with the composer and understand his intent. Now, before that, I mean, you were a seriously well-trained musician. You went to all the top schools. Like when you looked at a Bach suite like this, what was it? How did your mind think? Because you did compose variations. You're clearly a creative person. You're a talented cellist. Like what was the difference in your thinking process? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I just used the tools that I had, which would be maybe some Roman numeral analysis. I might sort of generally understand when I'm in the tonic or modulated to the dominant, maybe could understand some of the harmony changes. And especially after doing basso continuo, my fingers would start to feel patterns of first scale degree, second scale degree. I'll give you another example of, and I was playing at 415 on that cello, but here's my cello at 440. But I would recognize after playing basso continuo some of the rule of the octave kind of pattern. Maybe you could put up the Dall'Abaco second page.
Oh yeah. Okay.
For example, it's the second page, but
second page.
After playing basso continuo, I started to feel those 7-1 patterns or the second scale degree pattern. All of those kinds of things have been coming through my study of basso continuo. But what I didn't recognize, actually, maybe go back to the first page.
What
one? I didn't recognize was solfeggio patterns, which is what they might seem sometimes simple, like just do re mi or re mi fa, but once you study them and you see how strong the underpinnings are, you recognize how the composer himself thought about the music. So, for example, that's just a re mi fa do yeah, do re mi fa do re mi, and I sort of see, oh, I see how he constructed this piece, or how he outlined the piece. I think it's, Minute can say more, but I think it's the way that they were thinking about it. So before I did solfeggio, I was thinking more about my fingerings and my interpretation, but not really able to maybe add ornamentation, or add my own sort of understanding of it on my own terms. I think with actual real knowledge of the style and of the compositional tools that they had. I think it was just based on the tools that I had learned up to that point, which was really not very composition or improvisation based. Maybe just a bit of analysis. I hope
Nick,
that makes sense.
Yeah, do you want to add to that? That's a very profound thing that she just said.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I was the only one who heard things like this. No, so it might be nice actually to hear Elinor do some improvisation. I mean, that might be really interesting for listeners, because it's one of the things we've worked on is going through actual solfeggi and working on these melodic discourses, how to interpret them, and so on. That's something we can talk about later. But one other thing we've done is where I would, for instance, play the role of maestro, and I would sing a little syllabic thread. It could be something like re, mi, fa, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, something very, very simple. And then Elinor has to embellish using various restrictions.
Okay.
So Elinor, perhaps do something like a re, mi, fa, like a 1, 2, 3 in a minor key. For those who don't realize it's do, re, mi, fa. Re, mi, fa is 1, 2, 3 in a minor key.
So we already have worked on this, so I'll just keep the same key that we've always done, which is C minor. So would be a re mi fa, and then if I wanted to embellish, I'd be or I could go
That's just re mi fa. It's so crazy.
That would be.
We can do 100 more versions.
Oh my goodness.
That would be more partimento style, like with harmonies, or so that's keeping a kind of on the beat.
Can you put some chromatic notes in, Elinor? Do us some chromatic notes and some lovely circling figures, something lyrical.
Okay, I just full disclosure, I kind of know what Nick wants, where he's guiding me, but something like that.
And now, can you maybe put the fa down an octave displacement, so we've got that different contour to the melody?
Yeah.
Beautiful. So we can do a lot.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is all re mi fa. This is all re mi fa. I think it's important, by the way, for listeners, just to say to listeners, because we had some questions about Guidonian hand and this kind of thing. Let's just clear this up from the start. So the word solfeggio simply means a system of note naming, and all you have to do is count up to 6. If you can count from 1 to 6, you can know this system. That's all it is. It's a scale that has 6 notes, not 7. do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, 6 notes. You don't have the 7th. And then there happen to be 2 of those patterns in every key rather than 1. So all you have to do is count to 6. So adding the syllables is not the difficult thing to do. That's actually very easy to do. What's difficult is what we would in the past have called the art of singing, the art of playing, the art of improvising, the art of composing. All of those things are involved in what we now call solfeggio. But actually, it's the art of singing or the art of playing, cantare, suonare, in 18th century Italian. So when Elinor is playing a re, mi, fa with all these different variations, of course, we can say, well, that's a solfeggio in the sense that it's a series of syllables, which is the framework. But really what she's doing is the art of playing. And if you know composers like Tartini, for instance, his Arte dell'arco, the art of the bow, it's all about variations on the same frameworks. And the idea is that you didn't have to play it the same way twice. You could play the same framework, let's just say re, mi, fa. You could play those 3 notes in 1,000 different ways. So the difficult bit is actually the art of playing or the art of singing. The easy bit is the art of solfeggio, because that's just putting numbers 1 to 6 to a series of notes. And the reason it's important to have the 6-note pattern rather than the 7 is that it really explains the patterns that were in the minds of these musicians. Because if I say, for instance, la, sol, fa, mi, that makes perfect sense. They're the same intervallic pattern. Whereas if I do it in any modern system, they don't make sense. You know, if I did, for instance, mi, re, do, si, la, sol, fa.
What is that?
3, 2, 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
I'm going to remember that pattern.
Well, whichever way I do it, it doesn't really make sense. But in the 18th century way, having 6-note scales really makes sense. It shows you the patterns they were using. Now, that is not that difficult. You know, it's 6 notes, and you find them within the 7 notes of the key. There are 2 sets of them, and you can name them. But after that, knowing how to see them in a complex melody, let's say, that's where everyone finds it difficult. It's all very well when you have a scale. Oh, I can easily put do, re, mi to a scale, you know.
Right.
But as soon as it becomes more complex, it's difficult. And the only way to do that is to start from the easy lessons and work your way to the complex ones. Because then, as Elinor, I hope, will confirm, you start singing simple patterns, do, re, mi, you know, and then you start do, re, mi, and you start to recognize the same patterns with different versions, different variations. And it's only by doing that when you get to the complex melodies, you can start to tell what's actually going on and where these patterns are. So the syllables, don't get hung up on those, everybody. They're not that hard. Playing and singing is quite difficult. It's quite hard to do, and it takes practice.
And I would say that the solfeggio syllables are relationships that
Exactly.
that reveal the inner workings of style and phrasing. Nick and I often talk about balance, about meaning. There's so much that's contained within the relationships of solfeggio that are much more than simply naming notes.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people get hung up on, and I think, I mean, I get hung up on this. I'm like, I got to make sure I label this right, or, you know, it can have a paralyzing effect. And maybe it could just take a minute, Professor Baragwanath, can you talk about, your book's been published for it's been some time out now. Do you find that people still make errors in the execution of your material? Have you yourself learned anything new since the book's been published in the way you interpret these solfeggi?
Quite a few questions there. Yes. So firstly, yes, I have learned a lot new since publishing the book, because the book was the fruits of many years of research in archives and trying to put together a historical story. I see my task now more as trying to apply some of this research in practice. So that's hence the work with Elinor, you know, and her cello concerts and so on. And this is a way of getting it outside of the ivory tower, if you like, and into the real world of music making. So yes, I've discovered a lot. And a lot of what I've discovered has been One, through new manuscript discoveries, and I can share some of those with you today, some really interesting stuff, where I'm very lucky, you see, because I've kind of made a name in this field. Everyone around the world who's doing research in the area, they send me their stuff to check. And by the way, everybody, I never ever steal anybody's stuff. So if you contact me when you found a great manuscript, I'm very happy to offer advice, and I will not steal or publish anything about your discovery. But what it means is I get to I've got my finger on the pulse, and I get to see the latest discoveries around the world. And there's been some amazing discoveries, which I can show in part, but I'll be careful not to say too much because they're other people's projects, working in lessons. So on the one hand, there's been new manuscript discoveries. By the way, I've got to be careful with this, but they do seem to prove what I said in 2020. I haven't found anything that has radically changed my mind or disproved claims I've made. The second thing, though, is experimental lessons. And I quite often work with musicians and music teachers and so on in experimental lessons. So we say, well, how would they have used this source? What is the most productive way of trying to apply this? And it's trial and error. Sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. I'll give you an example. So the lessons with Elinor, we found that the maestro, whoever was teaching, must have been playing partimento at the keyboard. They must have been a competent partimento player, because varying the bass to suit the lesson is absolutely essential. The melodic instrument, whether it's cello or violin or voice, doesn't matter, needs the support of the bass. The bass is essential. And the maestro has to adapt the bass to fit the lesson. So the idea that you'd have a maestro and no keyboard player is no. I think that we can feel fairly confident in assuming that in the 18th century, when you studied solfeggio, someone was there playing a bass. And most likely the maestro playing the basses.
Luckily, I can sing solfeggio and play the bass on my cello, so it's convenient to be a cello player. And I wanted to just say, I hope I'm not interrupting, but that it's been interesting to just explore with Nick where our project has, what directions has gone organically. And it turns out that learning how to compose a stylistic and correct bass is one of our main activities. So, and right now what I do is I take a Cotumacci solfeggio, I'm going through them sequentially, and I identify the syllables. And Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm usually now able to do it without too many errors.
Yeah, your syllables are absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's and sometimes that's exciting and everything, but then making a bass that is not only error free but also stylistic and supports the melody, and that is has enough variety, that is a whole other skill. And so as I learn to identify the melodies, I also am learning how to compose. And then I also am learning how to compose the melody as well. So I did write my own solfeggio and write the bass to it. And then we get into discussion of how the rhythm of both parts support each other, how there's contrast, what is the sort of topic? Maybe it's a military style, maybe it's a cantabile, maybe it's dancing. And so the solfeggio has led me to really engage with my own compositions and my own thinking about music in a very practical way. And if you heard my composition, I sincerely think you'd think, well, that sounds pretty much like 18th century music. And I mean, I have been working hard at it for a few months, but it didn't take, let's say, 10 years to get to this point. But it's very possible, I think, to be able to compose in a convincing style, even though I have much to learn and far to go. So I don't know, maybe Nick, you can jump in about all that.
No, this is fabulous. There's so much more to it. And one thing I would really stress is that in the 18th century, there was no such thing as an exercise, a technical exercise. I mean, Bach's Klavierübungen Scarlatti's esercizi, his famous harpsichord sonatas, were called exercises. They're lessons, right? But they're not really, are they? I mean, they're wonderful, wonderful, amazing music. And I always stress this with Elinor. I always say there's no such thing as an exercise, a technical exercise in this. When we're singing solfeggio, it doesn't matter if we're just singing do to re. It doesn't matter if there's just two notes. It must be musical. We must be doing something that's musical, that's meaningful, that has a sense of discourse, communication. So there's never any kind of separation from musicality and technical ability. And so if Elinor makes a mistake in syntax terms, say that's very easy to fix. You say, oh, no, I prefer a different bass note there or whatever. But actually lessons in style are much more meaningful. And so I might say to her, and which I often do actually, I say, well, there's nothing wrong with your bass. It makes perfect sense grammatically. But wouldn't it sound nicer if you just kind of phrased it this way or answered the melody in this way?
Or responded to the rhythm in an engaged way.
Yeah. So if the melody, for instance, starts to fragment, the bass should answer it in some way. It either contrasts or it agrees, or so we talk about the music as if it's a kind of dialogue and a means of human communication. So it's got to be meaningful. It's a dance, or it's a song, or it's a poem, or it's a lyric subject of some sort. So the music comes alive, and we mustn't use the solfeggio as a kind of abstracted theoretical tool, which is, by the way, a modern preoccupation. All too often we look at chord symbols or things like that, and we think, well, what's the correct, if in partimento, there's a 7/1 in the bass, I have to add whatever above this. It's more than that. That's just the very basic alphabet. The real art is saying, well, how can I turn this into music? So Elinor just marvelously demonstrated 3 notes, re, mi, fa. You can make that into 10 beautiful themes, all very different. And that's the art. The art is not being able to name syllables to notes. That's not the difficult bit.
Okay, can I ask you a question on the research project? So you were tackling the solfeggi of Carlo Cotumacci, and I know Professor Baragwanath, in group lessons, you would tackle maybe the first 30 or 40, the first beginning solfeggi. But I mean, take a look at this kind of stuff. I mean, it's like,
piece of cake.
Yeah. So
you'll get
Professor so you said you've analyzed all of them. I mean, all of them, right? And Elinor, are you guys working even at the advanced ones as well?
We are doing advanced ones now, yes. But it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah, getting there.
I mean, Elinor is a really hard worker, I have to say, and she actually, I can't keep up with her. I send her exercises, and then the next day she's like, "Send me more, give me more. I want to do more." So
can you make both of you comment on the? Oh, sorry, I just wanted a quick question on the Cotumacci.
Yeah.
Can you just comment on the more advanced Cotumacci? You said you'll get there, but maybe for people who are just looking at this and thinking, "What am I looking at?" I mean, like, can you just give a comment on the difficulty, the how to approach something like this, and just your thoughts? I'd love your thoughts on the more advanced ones.
Just say me. Those are the first 2 bars. I mean, you start to, over time, you start to just recognize the patterns, and but what the actual exercise at the more advanced level is teaching you is more about the variety of ornamentation and of style and compositional techniques, and not so much about the basic solfeggio. And so when you start to analyze J.S. Bach's music or C.P.E. Bach or Dall'Abaco, you can start to appreciate how they had their own personal style and their own personal way of handling the same formulas. And I think that's also a really important tool about this whole solfeggio adventure, is that I'm not simply trying to become an 18th century a version of an 18th century cellist. I'm also trying to become more myself and develop my own voice, and have the ability to look at let's say a sonata by Vivaldi and play it in my own way that still also respects the composer. So we can combine forces, playing his music and with my own voice. So I think that's one of the sort of end goals of Nick and I, is to get to the point where it's both interpreting and singing through my own voice and my own creative mind.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, if I could go to a classical concert and hear both the composer and the performer as themselves, that would be wonderful. I love that. On this issue of complexity in, for instance, Cotumacci Solfeggio, which are available online, basically, let me compare it very quickly. It's like learning a language. I mean, you guys out there, if you were, let's say you don't know how to speak French, yes? And if you start learning French, you start with very simple words, simple vocabulary, and then you might start with some very short phrases. And you'd have to repeat those in different settings until they become familiar. And you very gradually add more words and more phrases. But the essential language, the structure, doesn't really change. It just becomes much more, complex. But think how long it takes to do this. If you were learning French and you don't speak a word of French, you take 3 months at least just to get the basic vocab, the basic words, basic grammar. Up to a year to become able to read a book, able to do some, simple conversations. To be really good, we're talking 3 years, no? With a language, to be really fluent. And it's exactly the same with solfeggio. Those Cotumacci 115 are meant to be taken over 3 years as a minimum, probably 4 or 5 years, actually. And when you start, after 3 months, you start to be able to say, "Can I have a cup of coffee, please?" in the language. And after a year, you start to be able to talk in a much more fluent way. But it's really up to 3 years before you're absolutely fluent, where a native speaker would say, "Yes, I can really understand you. You can really convey your meaning." And I would say that Cotumacci Solfeggi are the same. And they are just as progressive. You cannot jump into the middle. As with a language, you wouldn't suddenly learn a complex sentence with lots of new words. You gradually build up, you add. You don't, suddenly go somewhere you haven't been. So for those who struggle with the later Cotumacci, welcome to the club. Yes, we all do. They are difficult. But the way to do it is to work slowly through the entire collection. And you'll see that from one to the other, the same patterns keep reappearing. It's slightly more complex, slightly more embellished. And by the end, I've got to the stage now where I can spot them at a glance. I don't need to work at it. I can absolutely see from these solfeggi what's going on. And I think, Elinor, up to the intermediate level, if you like, you're getting to that point too, where you're constantly saying to me, "Isn't that such and such? And didn't we see that in the one before?" And all this kind of thing, which is exactly what you do when learning a language. You say, "Oh, I've come across that phrase before. I heard that. Where did I read that?" It's the same process as learning a language.
So just to answer Ezekiel's question here about, that was really good. Don't get too hung up about the Guidonian hand. Now, this matter about clefs. Now, do you guys work on clefs, or is it all oral, no sheet music other than the solfeggio? So, Elinor, are you doing what the Neapolitans apparently, or as Professor Baragwanath says, use 2 patterns and can read everything? Is that part of the research project? And if not, why didn't you just answer that question about being fluent in all the clefs?
Well, if you read chapter 5, Canto Fermo, Canto Figurato of Nick's book, you'll understand why it's possible to quickly jump between clefs, and how the clef symbol sort of gives you the fa, which is the sort of the main note of of a hexachord or of a scale. Is where's the fa? Where's the fa? Or sometimes 2 fas, of course. And although it still takes practice, and is, when they were doing plain chant as little boys or little girls, working kind of child labor for all the churches of Naples and Rome and Venice, these were some of the basic skills that they had to have in order to succeed with the needs of the church. But I, as a cellist, don't really have, frankly, it's not necessary that I be able to sing and jump around between clefs in order to interpret my sonatas and concertos. Although I think that sooner or later I could do a little work on that and probably get pretty good at it from having worked so much on solfeggio. But No, this is not like really something that I'm doing so much. So I'll pass it over to Nick.
Well, Elinor doesn't need to. She's a fluent reader of tenor clef, treble clef, bass clef. She has no problem.
Alto clef.
And,
yeah,
and likewise, you're used to different keys, so we don't really need to. But very quickly, I'm going to have to publish on this because it's there's too much to say. But one of the secrets they used in answer to Ezekiel, the pianist here, is that they feigned key. It's called chiave finta. So they feigned keys, and there are many, many sources that do this. And it's a very basic technique. If you have, for instance, a really difficult key and clef, let's say you have something in B major and it's with a baritone clef, it's nightmare. They would have a chart of which keys you could reimagine it as. So any particular key in any particular clef, they'll say, you can read that as C major in alto clef, or you can read that as F major in treble clef. And it's called feigned keys. And there were whole charts of these things and methods of how to do it. I've got loads of manuscripts with this. And it was a thing in Naples. It was a thing in Spain, probably everywhere else. I've got some other manuscripts from Central Europe with feigned clefs. So in other words, if you came across a really difficult melody that had multiple clefs and keys, you'd feign them. You'd say, I can read that as C major like this, or I can read it as G major. So that's how they did it. And I will publish on this, but it's quite a complex issue, so I'll need to set it out properly.
Yeah, Franz Liszt and Saint-Saëns were well known for being excellent score readers. Like they could reduce symphonies and into a piano reduction. I remember when I took lessons with, I think it was Professor De Mayre, and he did something in the sense like, if you can't read that clef, just think of it in a different clef. Is that the same principle? Just in
exactly the same principle.
Have some people just maintained doing that, like people who do this kind of reading throughout history?
Yeah, all the time. And in fact, a lot of collaborative pianists, when they have to transpose at sight, for instance, from a clarinet in E flat or whatever it happens to be, they can do that by reimagining the clef. So yeah, this practice still goes on.
Is there a particular Neapolitan way of doing it, or is this just the one way that they were good at? They just did it.
There is a Neapolitan way of doing it, but it does change through the 18th century. So the way they did it in the 1700s is slightly different from the way they did it in the 1800s, but it's the same principle.
Okay, great. And there is one more audience question I just wanted to throw in, and maybe we can throw in. It's let's see here. Okay. If you had to guess, how would you speculate that the division of the octave into the diapente and the diatessaron figured into the Leo Bologna tradition? Professor Baragwanath has written about this in your article on Vivaldi. At a basic level, it's a stepwise cadential pattern. But how far can we stretch this idea? Does each note need to be present, or is it enough to simply outline the ambitus of the fourth or fifth? Is it enough to have the endpoints be root position chords of the tonic dominant? Why is my audience so intelligent? It's just really bothering me.
I can simplify this very easily. If you, there's a wonderful dissertation by a guy called Andrea Borstein from 2001, which is on two-part didactic compositions in Italy. And that will give you hundreds and hundreds of examples of two-part didactic counterpoints, which were sung, or they could be played. And if you look at what's called the ricercar repertory, the ricercare in Italian, or ricercar, those are two-part contrapuntal compositions. They go all the way back to the Renaissance. The first ones are in the 1570s. There are thousands of these things, and almost all of them use the diatessaron diapente in counterpoint. So if you want to know how those two things go together, look at that repertory, because there's a whole couple of centuries of examples, which I can't possibly summarize now. But yes, the idea of taking the diapente and the diatessaron, putting them together as a counterpoint, is fundamental to about 2 centuries worth of contrapuntal didactic pieces.
Okay, great. So I do want to try to get through as much as we can. So here's another thing. Yeah, it would be great if we could go through some examples just to Elinor, would Professor Baragwanath take a solfeggio like this and kind of explain, how would this work in the research project?
Yeah, so I'm not up to this yet, but I would get a blank one, but with a blank bass underneath, and a bass clef staff, and then I would first write my solfeggio syllables above the notes, and they wouldn't be on each note. It depends on the bar or what's happening solfeggio wise. And then those solfeggio syllables would give me a lot of information about what kind of bass I might need to go with it. And I would probably, some of them would be really recognizable patterns. So I'd want to plug in a very common harmonic bass that I already know works well with those solfeggio syllables. Like for example, do, re, mi, I'd often want to put 171 underneath that. And then I would try to make my bass be interesting and stylistic and respond to the character and the mood and some of the rhythmic patterns of the melody. So it wouldn't, sound too clunky or heavy or kind of clueless or low quality. So that's kind of the process that I would go through for our, and then I'd talk with Nick about it, and he might point out some special ideas that could enhance my understanding of style and composition beyond what is maybe even obvious on the page.
Sorry, Nikhil. Yeah, so this is it's a wonderful exercise, and my own opinion is that you should spend at least 2 weeks on an exercise like this. This is not something that, this should not be done quickly because there's so much to learn in it. There's an awful lot to learn. It's not a simple exercise at all. So what we do first of all is we try to add a bass, and the reason we do that is because you can't always be confident about the syllables until you know what the bass is. And as a very general rule, everyone listening, every syllable note will have its own bass note. And when I say bass note, I mean a fundamental harmony note. So the idea would be, the bass note's obvious there, isn't it? But what about this? I've got 4 bass notes. Only one of them is the fundamental one, which means there's only one syllable. Yep, so knowing the bass is very important to interpreting the melody. The two things evolved over centuries together, and they can't really be separated. But if you go down the page, I'll explain something about solfeggio to everyone. This is my own bass line. I composed this, and this is the syllables added. If you can look at bar 4, we'll just do a little simple bit. If I play this for you, I'll play from the beginning. Ready? And we carry on and so on. It's very beautiful. Now, if I tell you that the syllables here are la, sol, fa, mi. So in a basic lesson, listen to that, everybody. 4 notes. La, sol, fa, mi. We first of all teach how to phrase it. So for instance, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi. Do you see what I did there? Yep, so instead of just la, sol, fa, mi, I'm phrasing in 3 notes. Sol, la, sol, fa, mi. And I've just taken those 4 notes and put them in a little 3-phrase sort of setting. And if now, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi. That's one way of doing it. This has what's called an inganno, a deception. So instead of going sol, la, sol, we can go to the other sol within this key, which would be a 5th below. Sol, la, sol, fa, sol, fa, mi, or sol, la, sol, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi. And the finished product. And we've got music. And that is just simply sol, la, la, sol, fa, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi, with an inganno. Sol, la, la, sol, fa, sol, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi. And can you see we're creating music from a very simple pattern? In lesson number 1, you would learn the pattern la, sol, fa, mi. And in lesson number 56, you learn to perform it like this. Another really good example, if we have time, if you look down to bar 13, bar 14, okay, a little bit lower, because we can't go through everything.
Yeah.
We have here a very simple pattern. One of Cotumacci's favorite cadences was this. Do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do. So if we think of the octave, do, re, mi, fa, up to E, fa, mi, re, do. That was one of his favorites. And we've got an example of it in bar 13. Do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do. Yeah, but he then repeats. Fa, mi, re, fa, sorry, fa, mi, re, do. So he's gone to the other fa, fa, mi, re, do. And if I play the final thing, and we have a beautiful cadence. And all it is do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do. Do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do. So learning the basic solfeggi teaches you the pattern. And Elinor, we're very familiar with that other fa pattern there connecting.
Yeah.
And you can create music.
Can I ask a question about cadences? So, in college we learn about the imperfect cadence and the deceptive cadence, but when you're thinking solfeggio-wise, melodically wise, like you're thinking of inganos and different other things.
There are so many cadences.
Converting do, re, mi, fa, mi, re, do cadence.
Look, see, Elinor can go through a whole lexicon of cadences, but we don't. So in modern theory, we don't have words for these.
So, like in college, imagine instead of saying all these, perfect and whatever the vocab is, like wouldn't it be better if we just said the solfeggio syllable? I mean, just like, oh, that's that particular thing. That's that particular. Wouldn't that be a superior way of kind of crafting?
I think so.
Schematic cadential patterns.
It's what we do already have some quite clever words from schema theory for this. So in this example, for instance, according to Bob Jerdingen, that's a passo indietro, a step backwards, which I think is a nice, it goes backwards. And then perfect cadence, deceptive. Yep.
Yep.
Perfect authentic cadence. So those words are quite useful in some ways for the level of finality. But the actual details of the cadence are so complex that you do need the syllables. And Elinor will know this. We've the number of times, Elinor, we've done that particular cadence in hundreds of different ways. It's difficult to categorize in modern theoretical terms, to say, well, that's that type 1, type 2, type 3, these kinds of taxonomies. It's too complex for that. You couldn't do that with a language. You couldn't say, well, in French, how do I end a phrase? Well, how many hundreds of thousands of ways do you want? And it's the same in solfeggio. There are hundreds of thousands of ways you can end a phrase. So we can't give them clear labels. You just have to learn the language.
Another thing maybe to add is that those little phrasing symbols above seem pretty natural in this one, but in some other examples and overall, sort of seeing how the solfeggio syllables give you a common pattern can help you know where the gesture and the phrase lies. And so you're less likely to sort of bulldoze through a repeated fa or a change of pattern that you might not have recognized without practice in the solfeggio syllables. So I feel a little bit more confident now that in my interpretation of a sonata melody, that I'm going to have my agogics and my releases sort of following a bit better the intentions of the composer, and not simply I just don't recognize what's happening. So it gives me a bit of confidence as well.
One quick question, then we're going to go to the final image. But I have a question for both of you, which is, what was the most common mistake that you found, things that needed correcting?
Nick?
I'm not sure what you mean, Nikhil. Sorry, I'll need to.
Just like what aspect of the training seemed that needed the most work, essentially, like to get right, or just kept thinking, oh, this is something that we need to work on, that you saw. What is the most challenging aspect of it? Essentially, is my question.
My answer to that, again, would be to use the language analogy and say that when you're learning a language, quite often some parts of grammar can be difficult. You might get the past participle wrong a few times, or you might get your prepositions in the incorrect prepositions. It's little details like that are quite fiddly, but they take a long time to kind of gradually enter into your system, enter into your awareness. So I wouldn't say there's any particular obvious problem.
Like, if you start, for instance, like the La So Fa Mi, just like looking at it, like there's two different sols there. First, for starters, that's two different sols. You have to know that one is from two different hexachords. So there's quite a bit there, actually. This
is quite advanced.
Yeah.
You would not be reading this as a beginner.
Yeah.
If you're learning a new language, you would not suddenly start reading Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
You don't start reading complex stuff first. So if you'd spent a year or so training and you came to this, it would be very, very obvious.
Yeah.
Because you've done it hundreds of times before.
So Elinor mentioned those slur marks here, these phrasing marks.
Those are my construction marks. And so those are not necessarily phrases. Those are pointing out the constructions. Okay. So we've got each phrase ends with a cadence, and you can hear them. There's the end of the first one. Your fa, mi, fa into a passo indietro. Little comma cadence there. So it's showing the constructions of the melody. So things are not all one continuous line. They're all separate constructions.
Okay, so what is this manuscript source here?
Okay, this is a mid-18th century source. I'm not going to reveal it at the moment because I'm going to be publishing on this and I don't want to sort of preempt. But everyone can trust me, this is a manuscript from the mid-18th century. And we've got a lovely example at the top there. If I play this for you. That is an example of a trait. Can you see the syllables written in? Fa, mi. It's very rare to find examples of performed solfeggi in the 18th century, and that is one such example. And if you look below, we've got an example of what's called the syncope, the syncopation. This is what some viewers may know as old rubato. If you've read a book by a guy called Hudson, 1994, he talks about two types of tempo rubato. One is the one we know, the sort of Chopin, where you pull the rhythm around a bit. But the other one is where you play your left hand and right hand in different time. And we've got a lot of written out examples of these in Mozart, for instance, or in Turk and various other sources. Here's an example from the mid-18th century, which shows you, if you've got a figure like this, you can actually syncopate it. Yep, all syncopated. And if you look very carefully, can you see where it says cinco, showing where the syncopation's added? If you look under the stave, you can see fa, 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 re. Yeah, we've got fa, 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 fa written in there to say that exceptionally, when you're syncopating on a single note, you repeat the syllable. And that tells you that when you're not singing on the same note, you don't repeat the syllable. And we've got the re that follows. It's hard to read, I know, but we've got fa, 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 re, fa. Yep. And we've got an example there of when you don't sing a trait. We've got an example here from 1790s. This is a solfeggio written by an Italian maestro for a young aristocratic lady, and she's having her solfeggio lessons, very common in the 1790s. And the notation is by the Italian maestro. It's in treble clef, by the way. So that sounds like that. And the young lady, it's her writing there. She's first of all put a fa at the beginning, which is wrong because she thought it was in soprano clef. So she's made a mistake. She's then overwritten it with a re. You can just about see the word letter re there. And then on the B, a mi. Re, mi. And can you see she's written very clearly that you do not sing the ornament. You sing mi all the way through that ornament. So it's a great example. I've got one last example from this same maestro. This is an incredible example. If you look at the second stave, this is a solfeggio, by the way. The second stave has this pattern. Either he was joking with her or she was a really good singer, because singing those arpeggios probably is quite tricky and wouldn't have sounded great. But we've basically got a run and a down of scale and then an arpeggio going up. And what we've got here is D to C sharp. Now the solfeggio for that in A major here would be fa, mi, fa, mi. So we've got fa, mi, fa. But there's a problem. Can you hear that if it did this, there's no problem because it goes octave D to D. Fa. But this one doesn't. It does this. Can you hear it goes beyond the octave D? Now, if you can zoom in to the penultimate bar of this extract, right there, can you see that little line? Look at that little tiny line written by the maestro. And what it's telling us is, those two notes are not solmized to a different syllable. For instance, re, mi.
That's a trait. That's not a smudge.
That's a trait. You can see it's a penciled trait by the maestro. Yeah. And what it's doing is the singer's obviously got to those two notes and said, well, should I sing re? Should it be fa, re, mi? Which, by the way, I would kind of assume if I were analyzing this as a solfeggio manuscript. But that little straight line says don't. It says just sing fa all the way through. So we've got a wonderful example there of a maestro actually kind of clarifying, because traits were only ever used to clarify. They were only used when there was an ambiguity, when you couldn't otherwise get it right. So that's a lovely example of a trait for everyone to have a look at. I'm not revealing the source of that because there's a PhD student who's working on it, and that PhD student is welcome to publish it for themselves.
So to end off, this has been utterly fantastic. I have a fun question for just for solfeggio and just in general, and I've asked you this offline, Professor Baragwanath, but it was this. Let's assume Napoleon just lost, right? He lost at Austerlitz or so, and Italy and all parts of Europe could still continue doing hexachordal solfeggio. No enforcement of the fixed dose system. What would the 19th century have looked like in terms of composition, in terms of like the influence of the solfeggio? It's a speculative question, but I mean, I think it's fun. What do you think would have happened?
Okay, I don't know if my answer is going to please you, but we'd still have a feudal system. The solfeggio system of the 18th century is intimately tied up with the social system that it supported. And the social system was the aristocracy and the church, and they had their own music industries. And these industries were servants. They were kind of serfs. These were servants who were like Haydn, who worked all his life for the Esterhazy court, was a servant, and he wore a servant's uniform. And the solfeggio system was designed for apprentices who spent 10 years of unpaid apprenticeship learning their craft, who would then go into this industry as servants. In the 19th century, for many, many social reasons, this was no longer supportable. In some places maybe, but the revolutionary era of 1789, 1848, it was not tolerable to have these child labourers enter into indentured servitude for 10 years, then going to work in a church choir for the rest of their lives, or into a court at a chapel in some palace, So I think that the system is intimately bound up with the social circumstances that led to it. And those social circumstances go all the way back to the medieval feudal age. So my answer to that is, socially, it wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have been acceptable in the 19th century in Europe. Although the other answer is, of course, if you say, well, what would music sound like?
Well, that's what I want to ask.
If we didn't have Wagner, I think I'd be disappointed. So I'm quite happy with the way it worked
But
out.
he was a partimento guy.
He studied with Mattei. His only lessons really were with the same teacher as Donizetti, which is a really weird thing to point out. But yes, he did have knowledge of the Italian traditions in the 1830s. But I mean, how much we can extrapolate from that, I don't know. I think that's for another program, I think, Nikhil, to be honest.
So, a final question for you, Elinor. Were you a fixed dough or movable dough person in college? I mean, what did you start off with?
Yeah, I think that I'm a bit lucky in the sense that when I was a kid and I started learning cello at age 8, that we called notes by names like A, B, C. And so deep down, when I think about a note, I think of letter names. And it's so different when my students who are francophones or Italian, and they just really, the letter C for me is do for them. And um, I've been recently trying to teach a little bit of solfeggio to my students, and the best way to solidify something is to teach it, of course. And I've been happy to see that even people with a fixed do background, they start to understand and absorb the system by singing the solfeggio, and it just starts to make sense, and their brains, which are flexible and adaptable, just start to get it. So it's not a lost cause if you come from fixed do. When I was in college, I learned fixed do and had to solfege with fixed syllables, including the seventh syllable C, or some people say T. Um, but I don't feel like it's so ingrained in my mind that I'm struggling to abandon it, and I happily abandon that system for a system that is based more on the actual melody shapes, because it's rather annoying to try to put a syllable to every single note when it just makes your mouth full of marbles. It's too taxing, and it actually doesn't have much to do with music. The music is in the structure of the solfeggio, the way that I think Nick and I are, or that Nick's teaching. Um, and it just feels a lot more natural and a lot more practical as well. So, although I appreciate my education, I would love to go back and redo it with the kinds of things I'm doing now, because I think it's much more practically oriented and leads to real skills and a deeper understanding of the music that I'm playing.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, this is really fantastic, and I wish you two all the best with the research project. It's coming up really soon, and please come back again soon, because Hexachordal Solfeggio, it needs to be mainstream. It needs to be. This is the way it should be. I mean, I never learned this, and it just is so fabulous and so wonderful, and I think a lot of young people are very interested in this. So keep up the good work, and we will continue with more Hexachordal Solfeggio into 2025. Thank you both for being on the show.
Thanks, Nikhil. Bye to everyone.
Thanks.